Welcome, everyone. My name is Sean Randall Travers. The pronouns I use are he, his, and him, and I am the Executive Director of EDI Learning and Professional Development. Before we begin, I would like to point out the accommodations that are available for this webinar. There's closed captioning available. Just click on Captions in your menu and select Show Captions. We also have American Sign Language interpreters on video today. If you follow the instructions on the slide to change your view setting to side by side, it should work well for you. There is also simultaneous interpretation in Spanish. Just choose Interpretation in the controls and select Español. Simultaneous interpretation is being provided to and from Spanish. Seleccione interpretación en los controles del webinar y seleccione Español. If you did not understand what I just said in Spanish, please use the interpretation feature. To do that, please scroll to the bottom of the Zoom screen where the meeting controls are, and then click on the interpretation icon, the world, and select English as your language. If you are joining through the Zoom mobile app, cell phone, a tablet, or other mobile device, please press the ellipse, those three little dots, and then interpretation, and then choose your language. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge the land that we are on. The UC San Diego community holds great respect for the land and the original people of the area where our campus is located. The university was built on the territory of the Kumeyaay Nation. Today, the Kumeyaay people continue to maintain their political sovereignty and cultural traditions as vital members of the San Diego community. We acknowledge their tremendous contributions to our region and thank them for their stewardship. Thank you for joining us today for the first event in a joint series between the Office for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion and the Academic Senate, and another online event as part of our Tritons Belong initiative. We have additional events throughout the academic year and resources that may be found on our webpage. If you'd like to learn about the Tritons Belong series, the online events, and other related resources, please visit our webpage at diversity.ucsd.edu/edi-resources/tritons-belong.html, which we have also provided in the chat, and at the QR code on the screen. I would now like to welcome Dr. Becky Pettit, our Vice Chancellor for the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. Welcome, Dr. Pettit.
Thank you, Dr. Travers. And thank you to all of you who are joining us today for another session in the Tritons Belong series. As Sean mentioned, this is the first event in a joint series between the Office for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion and the Academic Senate. Today, we will hear from one of our very own colleagues, Dr. Barbara Walter, Professor of International Affairs in the School of Global Policy and Strategy. Her talk today will focus on America's changing demographics and its effects on democracy. Her expertise on the rise in violent extremism and political violence around the world, and even in the United States, will also shed light on contemporary issues. I'm grateful for this collaboration with UC San Diego's Academic Senate and for the leadership of our current Senate Chair, Professor Olivia Graeve, who will introduce today's speaker. Professor Graeve joined UC San Diego in 2012 and is currently an endowed professor in the Department of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering, director of the Calibaja Center for Resilient Materials and Systems, and director of the Program in Materials Science and Engineering, as well as chair of our Academic Senate. Thank you so much for your partnership, Professor Graeve. I hand this over to you for your comments and for our speaker introduction.
Thank you so much, Becky. It really is my pleasure to be here with all of you and to participate in this collaboration. I think that this is an amazing collaboration that we want to grow. And starting with Barbara, Professor Walter is really quite amazing. Barbara is the Rohr Professor of International Affairs at the University of California, San Diego. She's a New York Times bestselling author of How Civil Wars Start and How to Stop Them, which was named one of the best books of 2022 by the Times London, the Financial Times, Esquire, and Prospect Magazine. She is a frequent guest on CNN, MSNBC, NBC, and an active consultant for the World Bank, the United Nations, and the Departments of Defense and State. Professor Walter was the recipient of the 2022 Peacemaker of the Year Award. She is a member of the National Academy of Sciences, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a permanent member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and a TED 2023 speaker. Uh, and uh, and so I think that there is nobody better to describe this topic and speak to us about this particular issue today. So welcome, Professor Walker, and thank you for accepting our invitation.
It's my pleasure to be here. I've given a lot of talks. This is my first one at UCSD, so it feels like coming home, and I'm thrilled to be here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start by giving you context so that you can begin to understand where the United States is right now and where we are likely heading in the future. Let me go back to when I started studying political violence and political instability. It was 1990. It was right after the Cold War. And the small wars started to pop up. And I got really interested in why they were starting, why they tended to last as long as they did, and why they resisted settlement. So I basically tried to learn everything I could about political violence and political instability. And in 2017, I was asked to serve on a task force run by the CIA called the Political Instability Task Force. One of the goals of the task force was to come up with a model to help the US government predict what countries around the world were likely to experience political violence and political instability within the next 2 years. So it was very sort of topical. The task force was made up of two types of people. Half the task force were experts on conflict and violence, like me. They were academics, and half the task force were data analysts who worked for the agency. When the data analysts put together the model, they asked the experts to tell them every possible factor that had been statistically significant in any quantitative study that had been done on ethnic conflict, civil war, political violence to date. And we gave them 38 different factors. And some of these factors seemed pretty obvious, whether a country was poor, whether it was ethnically and religiously heterogeneous, whether there was a group that was heavily discriminated against. But we gave them every possible factor that we thought might matter. They went away, and when they came back, they said they said that only 2 factors were actually highly predictive, and they weren't the factors that the experts thought would matter. The first was something called anocracy. Anocracy is just a fancy term for a partial democracy. It's a country whose government has elements of democracy. So, for example, it holds regular elections, but it also has elements of autocracy. There's really only one party, and that party always wins those elections. Sort of a classic case of anocracy today would be Hungary. Hungary used to be a democracy, and then slowly and systematically over time, Viktor Orbán has sort of weakened and eliminated many of the checks and balances on power, and it's now sort of solidly in this middle zone. It turns out that political violence rarely happens in full, healthy democracies, the Denmarks and the Switzerlands of the world. It also turns out that political violence rarely happens in full autocracies, the North Koreas, the Bahrains, the Chinas of the world. That's for very different reasons, and we could talk about that in the Q&A. But if political violence happens, it usually happens in this middle zone, this anocracy zone. The second thing that the analysts found out was that whether a country was what political scientists called ethnically factionalized mattered a lot. So that's just a fancy term for whether citizens in countries organize their political parties mainly around race, religion, or ethnicity rather than ideology. So instead of joining a political party because you're conservative or liberal or you're communist or you're capitalist, you join a political party mainly because that's the party of whites or blacks, Muslims or Christians, or to bring it, top of mind to what we saw in Yugoslavia, whether it's Serb or Croat. If a country had these two features, if it was a partial democracy where citizens were organizing themselves into identity-based parties rather than something over ideology, the task force considered that country at high risk of political instability and political violence within the next 2 years, and we put that country on a watch list. We actually called it the watch list, and we sent that list to the White House. So that's what we know about when the risk factors for violence and instability. And what was really interesting about the task force was that even though we were meeting 4 times a year, and even though we were talking about countries around the world like Venezuela and Ethiopia and Brazil and India, we never, ever talked about the United States. And that's because the CIA is legally not allowed to monitor anything that happens within the United States or its citizens. And that is exactly the way it should be. But I was a private citizen and I was watching what was happening in the United States. And I could see that these two features, anocracy and ethnic factionalism, were emerging here in this country. And they were actually emerging at a surprisingly fast rate. So let me give you a sense of what's happened based on the data here in the United States. So the US's democracy has been downgraded 3 times since 2016. So if you look at the measure that the task force used to measure whether a country was a full democracy, a full autocracy, or something in between, by that measure, the US's democracy has declined in 2016, 2019, and in 2020. In 2016, the US's democracy was downgraded for the first time in quite a long time because international election monitors deemed the 2016 election free but not entirely fair. And a big part of that had to do with the fact that our own intelligence agencies had determined that the Russian government had, in fact, meddled in that election. We also got downgraded because we have a very, very unusual way of running our elections. It's done at the local level by parties. It's not done by an independent election monitoring agency the way most healthy democracies do it. And this was considered to be a potential conflict of interest. So we were downgraded in 2016. America's democracy was downgraded again based on this measure that the CIA uses in 2019. And it was downgraded because the executive branch, the White House, was refusing to comply with requests by Congress for information and was basically thumbing its nose at subpoenas brought from Congress. Now, this might not seem like a big deal, but it's actually quite a big deal because the way our democracy is structured, the main check on executive power is Congress. And if the executive branch is able to basically ignore Congress and to refuse to cooperate with Congress, this suggests an executive branch that is becoming more powerful than the other branches. And again, we were dinged for that. We were dinged for a third time in 2020, when for the first time in American history, a standing president refused to comply with the results of an election and actively attempted to overturn the results. So by December of 2020, the United States actually fell in this anocracy zone for the first time since 1800. So we were officially an anocracy. If you look at what's happened to America's political parties over time, you're also seeing an increasing concentration, with the exception of this last election. I'll talk about that in a second. But until 2024, we have been seeing an increasing division by race and religion between the two political parties. As late as 2008, if you were to see me walking down the street, a white woman, and you had to guess what political party that I voted for, you'd have a 50-50 chance of guessing. About 50% of white Americans voted for the Republican Party, about 50% voted for the Democratic Party. That has been changing since 2008, to the point where even today, the 80% of voters for the Republican Party are white. And that is in a country that is multi-ethnic, multi-religious. And if you look at the other side of the Democratic Party, the overwhelming majority of African Americans vote Democratic. It's been, until this election, it was over 90%. In the 2024 election, that dropped slightly, but 80% and more of African Americans still vote for the Democratic Party. Until this election, over 60% of Latinos voted for the Democratic Party. And if you look at Muslims, atheists, Jews, a majority of them all vote for the Republican Party. So we have seen this racial division, racial and religious division here in the United States by party. So if the task force had been allowed to study the United States in December of 2020, by our own measures, I believe we would have considered the United States at high risk of political violence and political instability, and we likely would have put it on the watch list. And of course, we know that a few weeks later, January 6th occurred, which was a surprise to the vast majority of Americans. It was not a surprise to members of the task force. So, there's also one other thing that I want to talk a little bit about. There's been hundreds and hundreds of studies done about what are the risk factors for political violence. And one of the other things that we now know is who tends to start political violence, who tends to push to weaken democracy. And it's, again, not the groups that most people think. Most people think that it's the most disaffected groups in society. So it's the poorest groups in society. It's the groups that are heavily discriminated against. It's immigrants who are treated poorly. And that is surprisingly not the case. They might be unhappy, but these groups often have absolutely no capacity to organize and cause trouble for a variety of reasons. The groups that tend to try to undercut democracy, to weaken it, and the groups that tend to turn to political violence, especially ethnically based violence, are the groups that had once been politically and economically dominant and are in decline. So if you look across history to other countries where we've seen this weakening of democracy and movements towards politically motivated violence. So think about Brazil recently, or think about India and Myanmar and the Philippines. All of these are cases where you have a dominant group that is demographically losing power. Whites in Brazil, for example, became a minority in that country during the Bolsonaro era. And the source of Bolsonaro's popularity was from this group that was losing its ability to win elections because demographically it was shrinking. So those are the groups that tend to cause trouble. And if you look at videos and you study what happened in January 6th, or more generally, if you look to see who are the big supporters of the MAGA movement, it is overwhelmingly whites. And if you look closer, it tends to be white men and Christians. And of course, that has been the group that has had a lock on political and economic power here in the United States from the beginning of this country. And the reality is that they are in decline because America's demographics are changing, and because by the year around 2045, whites will be a minority in this country. There is no stopping that. So where are we today? Where does this put us, given what we know? America today is out of the anocracy zone. So that is a bit of good news. Our democracy score rose in the spring of 2021. That was entirely the result of Donald Trump leaving power peacefully eventually, and of the incoming president and administration adhering to and honoring both democracy and the rule of law. So for a moment, America's democracy was considered healthier than it had been, at least more stable. And our score increased as a result. What makes people who study democracy nervous, however, and what makes people nervous who understand this model, is that the reason the score increased had everything to do with the party and the individual who is in power and the fact that they believed in democracy. And it had absolutely nothing to do with any sort of strengthening of democratic institutions. America's democratic institutions are no stronger today than they were in January of 2021. There has been not a single reform of our electoral process, of any of the many anti-democratic features that our government has during the Biden administration. Some were attempted early on when the Democrats had control of both the Senate and the House of Representatives, but the Democrats were not able to get enough votes to pass any of these reforms, and the Republican Party has no incentive to initiate or agree to any of these reforms because they are the beneficiaries of some of the features that are undemocratic, like representation in the Senate, like the Electoral College. And so they don't want to see any of these changes made. So that's what's happening on the partial democracy, the anocracy side. There's a potentially more hopeful story to be told about ethnic factionalism. As many of you know, one of the big surprises of the 2024 elections was that Latinos and African Americans, at least a not insignificant proportion of them, gravitated from the Democratic Party, where they have been solid voters, to the Republican Party. So again, about 80% of well, let me put it the other way, about 20% of African Americans voted for Trump. That's up from 10% in 2020. Latinos are a bigger story because they're a bigger proportion of the population. It used to be that only about 40% of Latinos voted for the Republican Party, at least in the 2020 election. In 2024, it was about half of them. So the Republican Party and Trump have been making gains with non-whites. And that, from my perspective, is a good sign because, again, it's countries where citizens break down along racial, religious, and ethnic lines. It's those countries that tend to be unstable and tend to experience violence. So anytime that you have more heterogeneous political parties here in the United States, that's going to be good news. So what does that mean about moving forward? We are living in a really odd time pre-inauguration. There's a lot of news out there. There's a lot of predictions being made. But in the end, we really do not know what Trump is going to do. So if I think about America's democracy, if I think about America's political parties, you know, it could get worse. It might not get worse. And in some respects, it might get better. But I do know that both of those important factors could change quite rapidly. So again, because our democracy and our political institutions are still quite weak, because many of our democratic practices rest on honoring our norms and not on any solid constraints, it means that if you have somebody in the White House who really does want to remove many of the democratic guardrails, if they do want to do in the United States what Viktor Orban did in Hungary, they could do it. So Trump could follow Orban's playbook. And what Orban did is he purged the judicial branch. He put loyalists in the courts. And then he weaponized the IRS and he went after his enemies. And when the enemies tried to counter those claims and fight back and pursue justice, the loyalist lawyers voted in Orban's favor. So we don't know if Trump is going to do this. We don't know if he's actually going to try to jail people like Adam Kinzinger and Liz Cheney or journalists who've been critical of him. We don't know to what extent he's going to try to intimidate and silence the media. We're going to have to wait and see whether he does that. And then we're going to have to wait and see if he does that, whether he's successful. Will Congress try to push back? Congress is supposed to check executive overreach. The Republican Congress didn't do that to Trump in his first term. I suspect they won't do it in his second term, but there's been a few hopeful signs where Congress hasn't been willing to sort of give the green light to some of Trump's appointments. So maybe we might see a Congress that is actually holding on to its own power and wielding its power as a check on the president. We also don't know how the American public is going to react. One of the most effective means to check wannabe authoritarians is actually popular protest and peaceful resistance. There's a really, really rich academic literature that shows the effectiveness of peaceful resistance and the type of resistance that works. Here in the United States, that's going to be really, really interesting because African Americans have a long history of peaceful and effective resistance here in the United States, but white Americans do not. And you know, I'll give you a personal anecdote. One of the big surprises to me was when Roe v. Wade was overturned, which I thought would just absolutely bring women and many Americans into the streets. There were no protests at all. So a big question mark in my mind is, okay, if Trump really does start eliminating certain rights and freedoms, if he does start going after certain minority groups, if he starts to go after critics of his, what will American citizens do? Will they stand back and hope that this doesn't affect them? Or will they see this as something that's going to have larger implications and that they need to become involved in? Again, that's an unknown at this point. In terms of the Republican Party and Latinos especially, this is so interesting to me. And again, I think probably a surprise for many in the Republican leadership and potentially for Trump as well. Trump won in part because of the Latino vote. And they are a big constituency, and they're growing. So as the white population is declining, the Latino population is growing. If you want to win elections in the future, you have to gain some of the Latino vote, which Trump was able to do in 2024. So again, it's interesting because if he does follow through with some of his threats to deport illegal immigrants, if he does change citizenship rules, for example, if he does heavily restrict immigration, this is going to disproportionately affect the Latino population, and it's not going to make them particularly sympathetic to voting Republican in the future. And again, we all live here in California, and many of you probably lived through the Pete Wilson era in the 1990s. For those of you who didn't, one of the big reasons California is such a deep blue state is because the Latino population here votes very heavily for the Democratic Party. And they do this in large part because Pete Wilson and his heavily anti-immigrant, anti-Mexican policies of the 1990s alienated that important population for decades. So, one of my hopes is that this will serve to moderate some of Trump's policies and to convince the Republican Party that this platform of catering to a very heavily white voter base is not a winning strategy, and that they have an opportunity right now to begin to broaden their base to include Latinos and African Americans, rather than to alienate them further. So that's what I see coming up in the next year. Let me talk about the next 20 years. I think America is in for 20 rocky years. And it's not going to end with Trump. It's not going to end with whoever the next Democrat is. It's going to be rocky because America is going through this really large demographic transition from a white majority country to a white minority country. It will be the first democracy to go through this. We will not be the last. Canada will follow us, and then probably Australia, New Zealand, and eventually the countries of Europe. That could accelerate if climate change is as severe as many people predict, and that causes mass migrations from the global south to the global north. Many of those migrants are likely to try to move to the wealthy liberal democracies of the West. And this could change demographics there faster than we otherwise would have thought. So demographic transitions create instability and they create periods of violence. And that's because the dominant group rarely goes down without a fight. And the United States is going to go through that. So a lot of what happens in the next 20 years will be about how we as a country navigate this transition. And we can try to fight it out, and we can try to destroy our democracy in an attempt to cement white minority rule. We could do all sorts of nasty things that will ultimately tear us all apart. Or we can actually come together and we can figure out how you really work through these transitions that everyone's going to go through. And in the end, actually truly build the multi-ethnic, multi-religious democracies that we like to think we already are, and we certainly hope that we will be. So I'm going to leave it at that. I'm happy to take any questions that you like, and there's a lot to talk about and a lot to figure out.
Thank you, Dr. Walter. Thank you very, very, very much. Powerful lecture. Before we conclude our time together, we have a number of questions that we have received. The first one is somewhat of a clarifying question, so I'm going to ask that one first. Dr. Walter, early in your talk, when you were explaining about voter patterns in the US currently, you mentioned that the majority of Muslims, Jews, and atheists vote Republican. Is that what you intended to say?
Oh, no. No. I'm sorry. That was a mistake. They vote Democrat.
Okay. A number of folks heard that and queried that. I heard that. So I wanted to make that clarification first. That's an easier question. Okay.
Yeah.
Now here's a
I'm so sorry. Yeah, no, that is absolutely untrue. They vote solidly Democrat.
Absolutely. Now, another question. Considering the current climate and the context that you were just describing, plus the research that you have done and how you are interpreting that research, what are some ways that folks at UC San Diego can make a difference that creates a more positive climate? The faculty, staff, and students that are here on this webinar today.
Geez, there's so many ways. Let me talk about the simple ways. Let me talk about the institutional ways, and then I'll talk about the personal ways. Institutionally, vote. The demographic that has the lowest turnout historically, and that continued in 2024, are young people 18 to 25. So that's our student base. And again, if you start voting as a young person, you tend to continue to vote throughout your life. So voting is important. And if you look at the results of this election, people like to talk about the fact that one of the stories that's being told is that America has shifted to the right, that voters themselves have become more right-leaning. And the data do not support that. What happened in this last election is that voters that tended to vote Democrat stayed at home. So turnout was lower, and it was lower on the left in the 2024 election than the 2020 election. So turnout matters. Young people's vote matters a lot. And that is by far the easiest thing that they can do. The second thing that I think, I didn't talk about this at all, but we talked about why is this happening now, and I talked about changing demographics. There are other reasons as well, and one of the reasons is the rise of social media. We have become more divided, more angry, more controlled by conspiracy theories. We have allowed our enemies like Putin and Xi Jinping to inject democratic propaganda directly to our citizens through social media. So, until today, and we'll see, the Supreme Court's going to be voting on TikTok, I think this week or next week. This is going to be really, really interesting. But until today, the U.S. government and Congress has resisted any sort of regulation of social media, despite the fact that we now know it has significant negative societal effects. So I think one of the things we at UCSD can do is just start demanding that the government not allow the worst, most incendiary, most divisive misinformation, disinformation, and not allow social media platforms to spread all of this to the widest possible audience. And I'm not talking about censorship. Let people put whatever they want on the internet. Don't allow Mark Zuckerberg to hide behind the First Amendment argument when he says the US government should not regulate social media in any way. Don't regulate content, but regulate the algorithms that today are disproportionately pushing the most negative, the most harmful material out into the hands of American citizens. So that's another thing. And then pay attention. Just pay attention to what's working. If you have a chance, read one article on Viktor Orban and the method by which he really eliminated democracy from Hungary, because Trump is going, if he's successful, will use that playbook. And then pay attention and be willing to take a stand. Don't be silent. Read Erica Chenoweth. She's a professor at the Kennedy School at Harvard. She is the world's leading expert on peaceful resistance. She has many books, but she has one fabulous book, which is basically everything you need to know about peaceful resistance. So become familiar with how citizens can take back power if it's been taken from them, and what we can do to really defend our democracy.
Thank you. Those are all excellent ideas. One of the things, Dr. Walter, that our question was asked around, you mentioned January 6th was not a surprise to the members of the task force, although the CIA was not able to look in that particular way. The members of the task force was. Can you say more about what efforts may have been made to warn, if any, from task force members?
Oh, I should be clear that we at the task force never, ever, ever, ever talked about January 6th, talked about America. Absolutely not. I mean, it was so verboten. It is a hard and fast rule. I guess let me qualify. I suspect people who are familiar with the model were not that surprised, even though I have absolutely no confirmation, because I have never talked about it with anybody on the task force. I do know I have talked about it with other experts of especially political violence and domestic terrorism here in the United States. People who have been monitoring the growth of groups like the Three Percenters, the Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys. We've been sounding an alarm that these groups have been growing and organizing and preparing for violence for 10 years, and nobody wanted to listen. And many people just believed it either couldn't be true or was not really anything significant. So I know for a fact that the academics who study domestic terrorism and political violence, they were certainly not surprised, and actually relieved that January 6th happened, because it brought out into the open what we were seeing behind the scenes. I have no idea what members of the task force thought.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Another question that we got, someone was really hearing you in terms of your comments on Viktor Orban and Hungary.
Yeah.
And said there are at least three important differences between Trump and Orban. One, Orban rules a country and not a federal state. Two, Orban was able to write a new constitution. And three, Orban faces no term limits. Given those three things, what do you think about these constraints on Trump?
Yeah, I would say there's actually a fourth difference. Hungary is really, it's not entirely ethnically homogeneous, but by world standards, it's a very, very ethnically homogeneous country. So from a demographic standpoint, it doesn't look at all like the US. And that all of those four factors make Orban's work easier. It's allowed him to do that much easier than it will be for Trump. Also, Hungary was a relatively young democracy. Most of its citizens didn't have a deep experience with democracy. That's not the case here in the United States. Americans know nothing except democracy. I think Americans don't even realize the extent of their rights and freedoms. There's an article I keep thinking I want to write of like, what would a day in Des Moines look and feel like if a whole series of rights and freedoms that we take for granted simply don't exist, just to give Americans a sense of what that feels like. And in Hungary, they didn't have any rights and freedoms until maybe 1990. My husband's family is Hungarian, and most of them are just like, Orban's fine, but they have no idea what an alternative world feels like. If you start taking those rights, individual rights and freedoms away from Americans, I think that's going to motivate them in a way that it wouldn't motivate Hungarian citizens. So Trump has a harder path in front of him. But again, never underestimate the power of instilling deep fear, deep insecurity, deep uncertainty. Never estimate the power of a crisis, whether it's real or created, to allow a strong man to grab control. Because in the end, people prefer order and security and safety to freedom and democracy. It doesn't mean they don't care about freedom and democracy, but if they're really scared and they think in some ways their lives or their families are threatened, they tend to allow a strong man to emerge.
You talked about, Professor Walter, the potential of regulating the algorithms. A question that was put to us, given the powerful driving force of social media and the recent decisions regarding fact checking, how might that play into the misinformation, in particular through the lens of a college campus?
Oh my God. I mean, we are in an information environment we have never experienced before. And it's evolving rapidly and in real time. And that's not just social media, it's AI, it's a government or a president who wants to encourage actually disinformation and misinformation. And we have our first generation of college students who that's all they've known. I think it's a real problem that first of all, we don't understand the extent of it. And we don't yet know how to address it. I know as a professor at UCSD, the classroom is just a totally different environment. I have students who've never read a book. They don't read books. They don't even read anymore, right? Most information comes through videos. So they're watching it, they're listening to it. If they do read, they're reading headlines or it's very short. And now we're entering a world where students don't have to write anymore because we have the technology that will write for them. And if you're not reading and you're getting your information from social media, where it's being fed to you based on the material that's most likely to hold your attention and not based on what is true, what leads to a calmer, healthier, more peaceful society. It's just feeding you whatever it thinks is going to hold your attention for the longest possible time. Then we're basically becoming less knowledgeable about real things, and certainly about history and about all the things that allow us to avoid redoing the same mistakes all over again. So it almost feels to me in the classroom, this is probably somewhat hyperbolic, but it almost feels like we're watching the decline of a civilization, right? We are getting less knowledgeable, and that's, I know, like, I'd sound like my parents or old people who are just like, you got blah blah blah, but it is a radically different information environment, and our brains are not being trained to focus and to concentrate and to go deep into subjects and to analyze those facts and to try to be critical of what's happening and to try to analyze why things are happening. It's and I think we're likely to be more easily led and misled as a result.
Read more broadly, be more analytic, think more critically.
Yeah.
These are some of the themes. I have somewhat of a two-part question. The first part will be an easy answer. The second part may be a little more thought-provoking. First, can you repeat the name of the author at the Kennedy School? One of our participants wants to get that book on peaceful resistance.
Love it. First of all, she's a force of nature. Just like, if you ever have a chance to knock on her door. She is incredible. Erica Chenoweth. Go to her website, send her an email, tell her I gave her your name. She really is quite incredible and a model. She's much younger than me. We started a blog together in 2012. She is a model of I think what a true American citizen can be, should be.
And that first part, because the book was around peaceful resistance, the second question was around one of our viewers really heard you say popular protest and peaceful resistance works as supportive of democracy.
Yeah.
Can you talk more about that, again, through the lens of the potential for college campus folks to activate those means and methods?
Yeah. So let me give you some examples first. So prior to 2010, the most authoritarian countries in the world, by far, were all in North Africa and the Middle East. That was the hotbed of deep authoritarianism. And then the Arab Spring happened, and it started in Tunisia, and it moved across North Africa, and it went through Egypt, and it went through Iraq and Iran and Syria. And everybody thought they were just going to get slaughtered, or at best, they were going to have absolutely no effect. And what we saw was that in a shockingly short period of time, weeks in some cases, these decades-long authoritarians, Ben Ali in Tunisia, Mubarak in Egypt, and it took 13 years, but Assad in Syria, Gaddafi in Libya. Nobody thought these guys were ever going to have to leave. And in a relatively short period of time, they stepped down. And they stepped down because once their citizens stood up, and a significant portion of them, Erica Chenoweth talks about how you need about 3% of the population, and it has to be sustained. Once that happens, these dictators will leave. And it's not necessarily because of the protesters per se, but they lose the support of the military and the business community and key constituencies that they need to hold power, because those constituencies see, like this is a deeply unpopular, like they don't want to be fighting against the citizens. they'll just find another less unpopular leader to put in place. And it's a very effective means of getting rid of these longstanding dictators. Here in the United States, I think in some respects it would be easier because, one of the so we have a Supreme Court that is significantly more conservative than the average American on almost every issue. On almost every issue that this Supreme Court has voted on, gun control, abortion rights, you could go down the list, majorities in every state, blue and red, disagree. And so we have a Supreme Court that is pushing through policies that a majority of Americans do not agree with. And they're doing that because they can, because they're getting away with it. If you started to see Americans out on the streets protesting these decisions, I have a sense that Supreme Court justices are not the bravest people in the world. They're not the bravest people in the world. They will shift. But again, as long as Americans remain complacent, or another way of saying that is as long as it appears as if they agree with this because they're not willing to do anything to change it, those groups and individuals and organizations that do care deeply about preventing gun control or about preventing abortion rights, they are going to put the effort and the time and the money into it, and they're going to win as long as the rest of us do nothing.
So people need to do something.
Yes.
Something.
Yes.
Dr. Walter, that is all the time we have today. We had many more questions, but those were wonderful responses. Thank you for sharing your time and your expertise with us. For those of folks attending, you may read more about what you heard today from Professor Walter and how her research from her book, which is entitled How Civil Wars Start and How to Stop Them, through the UC San Diego bookstore by scanning the QR code to purchase your copy. The link is also in the chat, so you do it there. You can visit our webpage for more information about Tritons Belong and our initiatives by using the QR code on the screen now or clicking the link in the chat that was just put in there. I want to thank everyone again for attending today. I want to again thank Dr. Walter for her expertise for sharing with us today, showing our commitment to learning and growing as we contribute as to a positive campus climate. We hope that you can join us at a future event. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Take good care.